welcome to another edition of Moore's Rolling Point Blank, the show where we talk about the major issues of the day and we go out on point blank. In fact, tonight we're going to talk about a major issue that isn't talked about. And why? Because we don't feel comfortable talking about it. It's unpleasant. And if you want to go into your land of pleasantness, probably right now is not the time to be watching the show. What the show is going to focus on tonight is people trafficking. It's a scourge on our humanity and something that doesn't belong, obviously, in our civilization. It's a huge problem, and you'll learn about it tonight. To talk with us about it is the head of that division at the International Organization on Migration, Ms. Christine Deddy. Christine, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Christine, International Organization on Migration, there's a lot going on in those words.
Right.
Yeah? Just to set the stage here,
Sure.
What does IOM do? What is its mission in this world?
Sure. We're actually the International Organization for Migration. We believe that migration is actually a good thing, and with the rise of globalism, we see a lot more migration happening. And so we want to help governments with their migration challenges. We want to see migration happen in a humane, orderly way. We're actually an intergovernmental organization, and our mission is to assist our member countries with their migration challenges.
That's really interesting because, in fact, a lot of the world's problems are also caused by migration as well.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, look in this country. We have the transmigration policies. And
Exactly.
else.
Exactly. Migration is everywhere, and it's an issue that affects us in every day of life. And so we have to certainly support our government member countries with their challenges.
Okay. You're involved in your area that you focus on is people trafficking. Now, this is something that is a little bit mind-boggling for most of us. It conjures up, memories of hundreds of years ago in America, slavery, which has been abolished for a lot of years. I think every country has signed on for the United Nations Charter on Human Rights.
Right.
And what exactly is people trafficking, and how does it exist in this world? In what forms?
Right. Well, in fact, it is a modern-day form of slavery, and what that means is that there are people who are horribly exploited every day. It's basically the movement of people, using deceptive means by force or coercion into some form of exploitation. It's a gross violation of our human rights. It affects, it often constrains people's right to movement, people's right to be free from exploitation or abuse, and it's really something that, you're right, it's a scourge on humanity, and we should be concerned about.
And okay, so in today's world, how does that take place? What exactly is people trafficking? I mean, again, in the slavery times, it was ships of slaves being sent over to wherever around the world. It was the trading of human bodies as if they were a commodity or something.
Right.
How does that take place?
Well, it doesn't happen so out in the open like it used to hundreds of years ago, but in fact it's still happening every day, and it's more underground. It's a form of organized crime where people are recruiting people into offering them jobs in the big city with big pay and nice lifestyles, and in fact once they get them into either a foreign country or another city, they exploit them. It is underground, but it's around us everywhere we look.
I mean, I pick up my International Herald Tribune or even my Jakarta Post every day, and I see advertisements for work, and I mean, these things are taking place as overtly as that.
Right. Trafficking can happen through legal channels, but also through illegal channels. You can have the, underground recruiter who's doing it illegally, forging documents and sending those people either across borders through unregulated borders, or you can have it happen through legal channels where somebody may in fact get a valid work permit to work in another country, but once they're in that country, they are at the hands of the trafficker and exploited. They're in a foreign environment. They may not know the language or the cultural context, and so they take advantage, the trafficker takes advantage of that vulnerability and then exploits them.
Okay. How big of a problem is this? In in financial terms, in people terms? What are the vulnerable age groups? Can you give us some statistics on this?
It's really difficult to have any type of reliable statistics on this issue. It is an underground crime, and so it's like, asking how many drug users there are in the world. It's difficult to get some kind of grasp on that. The UN has said that the profits from trafficking rival those of smuggling in arms or smuggling in drugs, which shows just how many billions and billions of dollars a year are made off the trade of human beings. But as far as numbers of how many people are actually trafficked per year, it's difficult. But for sure, I can say just, my own experience, there are millions, absolutely millions. And there are all kinds of statistics thrown out there, but it is difficult to...
Okay. What are and where are the frontline states in this battle? This war that you're fighting.
Yeah.
Where are the frontline states in this world that this is taking place?
Well, I think it's important to remember that trafficking happens to each and every country. It is not a country that it's only affecting Indonesia, or it's only affecting Thailand, it's only affecting Eastern Europe. In fact, it affects the Western countries just as much as it affects the third world developing countries. Western countries like the U.S. may be a receiving country. They're certainly affected by it just as much as Indonesia is. People are sent from developing countries and received in Western nations. So it's certainly a crime that affects each and every country.
Yeah, we've seen. I mean, your definition would extend then even to we've seen. Well, in America, they have regulations about workers. You have to be legally hired through an association. So that's an illegal movement of people, right? So we've had the Attorney General. I think Clinton's first nominee for Attorney General was hiring a babysitter or a maid or whatever, which is quite common, I believe. That's a form of illegal activity.
That's a form of illegal migration. It may not be trafficking. I mean, perhaps he did exploit her, and it was a case of trafficking.
She got into the States illegally.
Yeah, she got into the States illegally. But not all illegal migrants are victims of trafficking. It's those who are exploited in these inhumane ways. Illegal migration is not necessarily, it's not the same thing as trafficking, but for sure illegal migrants are vulnerable to trafficking. But definitely it happens in the United States.
How about issues like pornography? We've a lot lately. I've seen a lot. We've had these rock stars, one in Vietnam that, child pornography and this kind of thing. We see, it was in today's paper, another rock star, Peter Townsend, downloading pictures off of the internet. These are children who are being held without obviously against their will.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, pornography, when you recruit children into certainly everybody would agree that child pornography is a form of exploitation, and when that happens, they're committing a crime against humanity. And pornography is just one form of exploitation. We have prostitution, forced prostitution. We have forced labor into domestic servitudes, maids, and especially in Indonesia, who are held against their will, forced to work long hours, beaten physically, verbally harassed. And so really exploitation, runs the gamut. There's all forms of exploitation.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, carrying on from that, these victims of these terrible things, these pornography or women whose rights have been trampled on and the rest. I know you must spend a lot of time with your reintegration policies and the rest. How do you do that? I mean, how do you take a kid who's been through one of these terrible things? And I'm talking in a global sense now, not necessarily in the Indonesian context, which we'll get to in the next segment.
Okay. Well, I mean, in every situation, when you're dealing with reintegrating a victim into their community, it's incredibly, enormously complex because, in fact, maybe their family has trafficked them or their neighbor or their friend. And so reintegrating them back into that environment can be challenging. How do you reintegrate somebody with a criminal? And so reintegration programs require a significant amount of labor and a significant amount of counseling. it requires a significant amount of money to be able to reintegrate this person effectively. Our reintegration programs globally, IOM, typically run anywhere from a year to 2 years because you need that kind of time to invest into somebody to make sure that that reintegration happens appropriately. And we always have to take into consideration what the victim wants. And it certainly depends on what, in fact, she does want or he wants. Maybe they don't want to return back to their community, and if that's the case, then we have to find an alternative, suitable living arrangement for them.
Yeah, that interestingly brings me to another question. The cultural differences are enormous. IOM is dealing all over the world on these things,
Right.
and there's got to be huge differences. One size doesn't fit
Absolutely.
all.
Absolutely.
So in reintegrating people, for instance, in Asian cultures, as you just
Right.
mentioned, you want to do what they want. You want
Right.
to take the lead
Absolutely.
from what they want. But it's very difficult sometimes to find out here. It's what you don't say sometimes that's
Right.
really what you want, right? Because culturally, there's
Right.
huge
Right.
differences.
And that's why you have to have trained Indonesian or national staff working on these reintegration programs. I manage a program, but I'm certainly not the person actually interfacing with the victim and determining what they want. It has to be somebody that they can relate to and talk to. They can understand that local context or understand that language. And so certainly in our global programs for reintegration, we have staff that are from that country that can deal specifically with the individual. But it's challenging, absolutely.
And there's no one size that
There's
that-
no
that-
one size that fits all.
all.
I mean, even in Indonesia, I mean, if you look at all the different cultures involved and all the different islands, I mean, reintegrating a child into West Java is different than reintegrating a child into West Kalimantan, for instance. And so it varies significantly, and I think it's important to keep in mind when you're reintegrating these victims, the cultural context is. And that's why, again, you really have to work with the victim to determine what they want. But give them the broad range of options. That's what's important, is that you present them with a broad range. And often, often they'll simply be returned home, and that's not successful reintegration.
That's putting them back.
That's putting them back
to where
in
where the problem started,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And okay, let's carry on to Indonesia then. Where are your efforts lying right now? What are the core areas to you, the areas where there's really a problem, and in particular, because of the tsunami and
Right.
the dislocations that
Right.
took place in Aceh, is Aceh a priority area for IOM?
Okay. Well, a few questions. Our programs revolve around prevention efforts, return and reintegration of victims, and then law enforcement. Those are typically, you hear about the 3 Ps: prevention, prosecution, and protection. We make our programs around those 3 areas, taking into context the country context. So we have programs in each of those areas. Now, with Aceh, we do have a preventative program there because there are hundreds of thousands of displaced persons who are, in fact, vulnerable to trafficking. Now, in the early days of the tsunami, there was all kinds of reports, media reports, that there were children being trafficked out of Aceh, children being trafficked by Christians, Muslim babies being trafficked by Christians out of Aceh. And IOM sent a team up there immediately to get on the ground, a team of Muslim females, religious organization that went up there and looked to see if in fact this was a problem. Because again, it's cultural, and I couldn't go up there to determine if it was a problem. We had to send the appropriate people there. And in fact, we didn't find, in the early days, we could not confirm any cases of actual trafficking. And so those media reports were certainly overblown, the stories about hundreds of children being trafficked. We have, months later, confirmed that young women were being offered jobs in Malaysia and then ended up in Tanjung Balai Karimun, an island south of Singapore, and were held in a trafficker's house. And so there were, months later, and that's typically what happens in a disaster, after the dust settles, and there's these large places of displaced persons, traffickers, conditions are ripe for trafficking.
Right, and the syndicates
Traffickers get in there and they
and
start
yeah.
offering jobs and hope, because these people have been sitting around in tents with no opportunity.
Yeah.
And so they're easily lured by the promises of a false, of a big job and big salary. But the key to ACE is prevention, working at the grassroots level through the religious leaders and raising awareness in that way.
Okay. Christine, we got to take a break.
Sure.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking more about this terrible problem and how it's affecting us here in Indonesia. We'll be right back. We're back with Moore's Roland Point Blank, and we're back with Christine Deddy, in charge of this people trafficking with the International Organization for Migration. Sorry about that mistake earlier. Christine, you were talking about Aceh.
Yes.
And it didn't turn into the nightmare that we were concerned about. What other areas in Indonesia are the frontline areas where where there are terrible problems taking place now?
Yeah. Well, most apparently trafficking, as far as sending girls out, occurs mostly in Java. In Java, I mean, you always hear the statistic that it's 50 or 60% of the population with only 12% of the land mass. And so, again, you have a lot of vulnerable people not living in, good economic conditions, looking for a better way to better their economic condition. And so Java particularly is vulnerable to trafficking.
Okay, and which places in Java? And, specifically, for instance, I've heard that there are unique problems in places like Indramayu. Now, obviously, poverty plays a role in that, but there are other elements. There are family issues, there are networks, and the rest that you referred to before. Can you educate us on this?
Well, Indramayu is in fact an area that is a sending area for young girls trafficked into the sex industry or even into domestic servitude as well, maids, but particularly known for trafficking girls into the sex industry. Poverty plays a factor, but in fact, cultural context, cultural norms is also a huge factor in Indramayu, where it's the norm to send your girl, your young child into the sex industry. It's expected that she will be sending money back to the family. And what type of choice does that young child really have? Very little when it's just an expected tradition. And it dates back, hundreds of years. Typically, girls from Indramayu are sent either to Jakarta. In fact, there are many places in Jakarta where there are young girls from Indramayu in the sex industry. Also sent to Batam. It's a common area for Indramayu girls. And Surabaya as well. There's a lot of, when we talk about trafficking, we're not just talking about cross-border trafficking. We're talking about the movement internally as well. Women and men as well are moved internally into exploitation. And so in Indonesia, you have a little bit of everything. You have, it's a sending area abroad for those being received abroad. It's a receiving area for internal migrants, for traffic victims, and it's also a transit area in many ways. And so you have a little bit of everything in Indonesia.
Yeah, very complicated. Let's go back to these family issues, though. Yeah. You mentioned the history of, because it blows our minds. I got 4 daughters, and I'm not selling them to anybody, and it's just not going to happen.
Right.
How can that be historical or anything else? It's mind-boggling, and that obviously is the essence of getting to the root of the problem, isn't it?
It's incredibly complex, and I'll tell you the truth, James. I have a hard time understanding the cultural norms around Indramayu, for example. I've only been here a few years, and I too have a daughter. But how can you send your young girl into prostitution?
And it be accepted.
And it be accepted. I honestly, I can't give you an answer to that. It's something that's just been practiced for hundreds of years and is accepted. And so when you're talking about poverty being a root cause, sure, poverty is a cause, but that's not the only cause, because what we're finding is that we've now started a return and reintegration program for victims of trafficking. And what we're finding is that the girls that are being sent from Indramayu, they're not being sent because their family has no food on the table and is just living in extreme, extreme poverty. In fact, they, want a bigger house, or they want a bigger plot of land, or, they want maybe a motorcycle. That's much more complicated to address as far as addressing the root causes of trafficking than poverty. If it was as simple as providing that family with some economic support, some food and some basic necessities, then these girls would be much easier to reintegrate. But that's not necessarily the case in Indramayu, for example.
Oh man, you've got an incredible problem to address, because I don't think anybody, a rational human being doesn't understand that.
No.
A rational human being understands being hungry. Mm-hmm. And being hungry will make you do things that you otherwise might not do. But the need to have a greater house or a bigger house.
But a rational human being doesn't understand how you could sell your child for maybe $1,500 so you could buy a bigger plot of land.
It's unbelievable.
You can't understand that. And that's certainly not the case with every family in Indramayu, but sure. It is typical of the stories we hear about the girls that are being trafficked.
Unbelievable.
And it's difficult to try to reintegrate somebody like that.
Let's talk about the cover for this. I mean, again, using my image of big ships transporting, people and the rest. Very difficult that could take place without some type of security cover or some type of governmental cover. And I don't mean to say official, obviously rogue. I don't think any country would be engaged in those kind of things. But impossible for it to take place without some type of support or security cover, isn't it?
Right. Well, I mean, that's true to a certain extent, but let's look at Indonesia, a country of 17,000 islands, 2,000 of which are inhabited. So when you're talking about borders and easily moving, people from one area to the next, it's not difficult to do. And certainly even in an island like Java, when you're transporting people, there's so many people, in this on this island that the movement, can often happen without any regulation whatsoever. But that does happen. Your point is well taken, but it happens in every country where the movement of people through legal or illegal channels is happening, and it's certainly a complex.
Interesting, yeah. As you mentioned, it's a problem throughout the world. And there's bad police or bad security people or government people, anywhere in the world, isn't there?
Right. I mean, if you look at the United States, for example, I'm from the United States. Certainly you hear about many cases of trafficking happen, and people, again, they may migrate through legal channels, and so it's, once they get there, they're exploited. But you hear, the borders in the U.S. aren't tight either. I mean, there are often illegal migrants from Mexico, for example, who are being trafficked into exploitive forced labor conditions, and so it happens everywhere.
Okay. There were 3 P's: prevention,
prosecution, and protection. And when I mean protection, return and reintegration.
Okay. So, and obviously that's a big part of what you're big part of what you're doing here. How difficult? I mean, I would imagine that somebody who's been through something as horrific as this, they come back and then they just go through it again with society, which says you were a prostitute or whatever, you lived your life in this way, and we don't want to have anything to do with you.
Right.
And so they're victims, again and again and again.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Right. Well, in fact, it happens, but we have to be careful. I mean, we have a return and reintegration program together with the Indonesian government. And I think you just have to be very conscious of these issues, and you have to have measures put into place to ensure that victim is not re-traumatized, is not re-victimized. And so, as I said earlier, reintegration programs are typically a year to 2 years because you need that type of long-term support in order to successfully reintegrate a victim and to monitor. And so we work closely with the Indonesian government. They've set up now a recovery center for victims of trafficking, which is very impressive. I mean, they've dedicated a center specifically for victims of trafficking. The capacity is 30 victims a day, and every day since that center has been opened, that center opened in June, it has been filled to capacity. And so in the last 6 months, we've assisted over 500 victims.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's wonderful. But at that center, victims are provided with comprehensive medical care, psychological care. They're provided with one-on-one counseling with social workers, with psychologists. And so you need that kind of comprehensive, holistic approach to the recovery. Now, reintegration is the next step, trying to reintegrate them into the community. Now, again, there are certain measures you have to put into place to ensure that that victim is not re-traumatized.
Sure.
Security is a big issue.
I would imagine, because
Yeah.
your second P is prosecution.
Yeah.
And those bad dudes out there that are doing this,
Right.
those guys are afraid that they're coming back to where
Yeah.
they were, and they can point them out.
They can
right?
use them again, right? And so you need effective monitoring programs, and we work with the NGO community or the NGOs that are on the ground in those areas, and also the faith-based organizations. Fateh and Aisha of Mohammedia, I mean, they are really excellent grassroots organizations that can help monitor these women to ensure that they're not being re-victimized. But it's happened. I mean, some of the victims that we have sent back, they'll call us and tell us that they're being harassed by the original trafficker, and we'll immediately go and try to resolve that problem. But it's incredibly complex. You have to worry about security.
Government gets a good grade. This government, we're out of time, or we're almost out of time,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
government gets a good grade?
I think they've taken some significant steps forward. They've built this recovery center for victims of trafficking. They're starting to investigate more cases of trafficking. And they certainly recognize it as a problem, which is significant, and both internal and cross-border trafficking, which I think is significant. And so the Indonesian government, the fact that they've recognized it, there's now a bill before Parliament pending, an anti-trafficking bill, which hopefully will be passed soon. And so there have been really good government initiatives, but for sure there are many more things that they need to do.
A society is judged by how we take care of those that are less fortunate than us. And fortunately, we have people like Christine Deddy and IOM that continue to remind us about that. Christine, thanks a lot for being with us.
Thanks for
reminding us.
Great.
And we appreciate all your efforts.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
don't forget to join us next week for another edition of Moore's Roland, Point Blank.